Because focusing on the top. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Again, this says she can't speak, so I have to start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second session of the SARChI-HEHD Higher Education and Human Development webinar series for the second semester. I am Gloria Prempoeje, chair of today's session. Before we dive in, I am going to give some few housekeeping rules, after which I give the floor to the presenters to present to us. Those online, can you put your mics on mute? The session is going to take 1 hour, 30 minutes for the presenters, 10 minutes for the discussant, and then the remaining minutes for question and suggestions. Today, our presenters are going to present on the topic quality and responsible internationalization in higher education. And we are privileged to have our very own professor in Higher Education and Human Development Research Group in the person of Professor Faith, and one alumni who is also Dr. Patience. I will not be able to pronounce their surnames because I'm not familiar with it. Okay, I will read their bio, then I hand over to them to take the space. Dr. Patience is a lecturer in the University of Glasglow School of Education. She's interested in how universities foster human development and create more just, inclusive, and sustainable societies. Her areas of interest are conceptions and operationalization of quality in teaching and learning, internationalization, and student experiences of higher education access and participation. Patience focuses on the experiences of marginalized groups, such as girls, students from low-income backgrounds, and migrants, documented and undocumented in different higher education contexts. Professor Faith is a researcher with the Higher Education and Human Development Research Group at the University of Free State. Her interdisciplinary work, grounded in collaborative stakeholder partnership, sits at the intersection of higher education and global development, cutting across internationalization, migration, gender, and youth studies. I'll also read the bio for the discussant for today in the person of Dr. Nico. And his bio reads as follows. He is the founding director of the Office of the International Education, Nelson Mandela University. He retired from this position at the end of 2018. He is now the Senior Director of the Center of Higher Education Internationalization. Nico does research in higher education internationalization in developing and emerging world. He is also continuing his research in the history of South Africa with a specific focus of his research as a historian is on the maritime history with specific focus on the influence of mercantile fleet circling South Africa. All right, so without much ado, I'm going to give the space for the presenters to present for 30 minutes, after which the discussant takes over. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Gloria. And my surname is not difficult to pronounce. It's Mkwananzi.
All right.
And Patience is Mukwambo. Okay. But thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone online and in the room. Thanks again for deciding to join us today. I'm co-presenting, like Gloria has already mentioned, with my colleague Patience Mukwambo, who's joining us online from the University of Glasgow. And our presentation is, I heard you read a different title, but really the argument is the same. So it's responsible internationalization and quality in higher education, focusing on the South African context. We will discuss how quality assurance is framed, or how we think it is framed within the frameworks that we're looking at, and the limitations of this framing in the South African context, and also how we think the capability approach might help us to think differently about this framing and also to think responsibly. And this presentation, just in caveat that everybody makes when they start a presentation, it's based on a paper that is work in progress. So it's really developing the ideas. So what we're very much looking forward to during this presentation is feedback, questions, and suggestions in terms of how we can strengthen the paper going forward. Okay, so just to give you a definition of internationalization, the commonly adopted definition is Jane Knight's, I think it's Professor Jane Knight's definition. But since then, there has been developments in how different people in different contexts suggest that we define internationalization. For example, Professor Madison, who's in the UK, recently suggested that we consider the complexities that are within the internationalization process. And more recently, and the definition that we draw on is Heleta and Chasi, who actually draw on the South African context to redefine what internationalization might look like in Africa, and specifically for South Africa. And this is the work that we draw on in our writing of the paper as well, and in our previous writing, but we do once in a while go back to earlier definitions to strengthen the arguments that we make. For example, Knight actually identified 4 rationales for internationalization in her earlier work. And these have to do with the political, economic, social, and academic rationales. Briefly, the political rationale looks at the diplomacy and national security of countries and regions, or the specific political actors that are interested in the internationalization process. And there is one very common example that many people from the South have benefited from, and that's the DART scholarship, the German scholarship that is currently undergoing. In South Africa, we do have the NRIF and TWAS fellowship, which is the collaboration between the National Research Foundation and the World Academy of Sciences, which supports doctoral and postdoctoral research in South Africa in the field of sciences. So those are examples of how different countries can decide to position themselves politically in engaging in higher education. Then we do have the very common abroad, specifically in Australia and the UK, which is the economic rationale linked to the revenue generation and competitiveness of institutions. We see that how that is actually affecting the UK currently, the less number of international students that are registering in the UK, having an impact on the sector there. And then the third one, not so commonly spoken about, is the issue to do with social cultural rationale related to building intercultural competences and preparing graduates for a globalized world. There is a lot of work that has been done here on intercultural competences by Professor Dala Diadohaf. I think she is in Stellenbosch, who's doing this work. And then we have the academic rationale, which is about what we're here for, which is the learning and research through collaborations and knowledge exchange. But in practice, these rationales are often unevenly realized. Like I noted earlier on, the political and the economic rationales are stronger than the socio-cultural and the academic rationales. And this is because of a variety of reasons. King and Raghuran in 2013 already reported tensions between policy ambitions and lived realities. They focused on international students' experiences, and they said that there was a disconnect between the desired contributions by international students and also the reality of that they are seen from a migration perspective as unwanted because of the migration control measures. So there is a tension in relation to migration and policy ambitions in terms of what higher education internationalization can actually do. And so as a result, we do again, like I mentioned earlier, we have scholars like Professor Maganzan and Professor Tontlana, really highlighting the multidimensionality and contextual concept, or the contextuality of the concept of internationalization, and how we really need to focus on the different contexts and how the process plays out in these dimensions. And the argument that Patience and I are trying to make, at least in the paper, is, and we hope that
You can mute that person.
Thank you for muting. The argument that Patience and I are trying to make, we hope after this presentation and after your questions and suggestions is going to be clearer, is that definitions of internationalization tend to view internationalization as a process or as a means to enhance quality. So often there is an assumption that the more international students are registered at a specific university, or the more mobility exchange activities are happening at a university, between universities, then that equates to quality or leads to a better quality education. But it is unclear how such activities in themselves actually enhance quality without looking at individual lives involved in those activities. For example, looking at individual lives of international students or people who engage in mobility activities. All right, now getting to the higher education context in South Africa within this internationalization agenda. Since 1994, the country has been tasked with transformation and redress, but most of you are familiar with those arguments, so I'm not going to dwell much on those details. What we are interested in, and specific to our presentation, is that there's also been a very active positioning in the global knowledge economy by institutions in the country. And this is seen through policies such as the 2013 White Paper and the 2019 National Policy Framework for Internationalization. And these two frameworks emphasize regional cooperation, specifically within Africa. I think international students from within the SADC region, as an example, have added benefits compared to other international students in that their fees are actually lower than, for example, students from East Africa. So that's an example of regional cooperation within the country's agenda. And also, South Africa is increasingly promoting itself as a desired destination for international students, just like any other, for example, global north countries that are in the same space. And so far, we do know, and we have seen with the students that we have worked with in this project, that there are many students hosted by the country who are from, for example, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Mozambique, Cameroon, Namibia, and Eswatini. But although there are so many students from within the continent, and also South Africa is very ambitious in recruiting international students, there are definitely contradictions. The first one is that the Pan-African solidarity aspirations clash with the realities on the ground. For example, we do have examples of xenophobia. We have examples of increased challenges in terms of students being able to pay their fees. Students are still experiencing challenges in terms of getting visas. Visas are often delayed. So we see that in reality, there are so many challenges that restrict the internationalization process. And there is also another potential risk specific to South Africa, which we have seen in the global north, and that is the economic rationale. And in our view, we see this as having potential to eventually overshadow the aspirations of the country, particularly the Pan-Africanism. And it might eventually reduce international students to sources of income rather than full participants in academic life. Now, moving to quality assurance, the 2019 policy, which is a fairly new policy, and we should really give it some time to see how it unfolds. But again, it enhances, it focuses on enhancing quality of teaching, research, and engagement with the following guidelines. There are guidelines stated. We just decided to choose 3 specific to our presentation. And the first one has to do with the content and value of initiatives, that we should focus more on the quality of this rather than just numbers of students or staff engaged in the activities. And also the depth and outcomes of collaborations, whether it's student or staff exchanges, should actually lead to genuinely enriching learning experiences. But there is a gap that we identify. Back to our argument, the framework does not spell out on how to evaluate these initiatives, leading us to the limitations that we identify. There are 3 main limitations in a way quality is currently discussed or addressed in the frameworks. And based on our data, the first one is that internationalization is not fully integrated into universities' quality assurance mechanisms. There's also little attention paid to international students' capability expansion, whether they are gaining the real freedoms to learn and flourish within the space, and also when they go back home, or perhaps when they move elsewhere. And there's also very limited focus on their overall well-being. We know that these arguments can be made for local students, but our interest in focusing on international students is the way that international higher education is advertised for the students, that they will gain an enriching experience that they wouldn't otherwise gain in their respective countries. So to address these gaps, we think the CA does give us a way to recenter well-being in quality assurance discussions, and possibly help us to think about responsible internationalization, which Patience will speak about in a few minutes. When we look at capability expansion, we draw on Amartya Sen's work and also Robin's work. Sen defines capability as a person's real freedom and or opportunity to achieve what they have reason to value. So that's just the basic definition. The person has to have the opportunity to pursue or achieve what they have reason to value. This lens allows us to ask, does internationalization actually allow students to pursue what they have reason to value? In our case, does internationalization expand students' capabilities? An example of capability expansion, we deliberately did not list capabilities there that might be expanded, but there's so many of them, and we just use 2 as an example. The first example is multicultural learning and the intercultural dimension, which is the one that is being advertised or being encouraged within the internationalization space. For us, if the multicultural learning or intercultural dimension is expanded, it means that exposure to diverse epistemologies and cultural perspectives expands students' capability for knowledge diversity. Take, for instance, an international student studying here in South Africa, and they are interacting with peers from around the globe. And I think in this room, we are a perfect example of that. So you might be from Zimbabwe, but you're interacting with other peers from Zambia, Malawi, Nigeria, and other places. So what we see here in this expansion is that one does not necessarily become a mere recipient of knowledge, but instead they actually become a co-creator in multicultural learning, which other people in the same space might actually take and use elsewhere. We've got another example that we draw on, and that is the idea of building confidence. What is it that makes an international student or scholar confident. So from a CA lens, confidence is not just psychological, but also a capability for voice and participation. For instance, an initially hesitant international student can gain confidence through a supportive environment, and over time can develop the ability to present at seminars, conferences, or actually use that skill elsewhere. On student well-being, international student well-being, again, we use the very general definition that SAN uses. And according to SAN, well-being is not and should not be solely defined or reduced to access to resources such as student funding, but rather by the capabilities these students possess to achieve valuable functionings or what they can do and be. He emphasizes real opportunities and freedoms, not just potential. So in our case, this might include the ability to genuinely and freely engage and learn, not constrained by barriers such as language, ethnicity, among other social identifiers. And also it might include the ability to build relationships, friendships, and a sense of belonging in a foreign land. We also see this as, for example, when it comes to health, having the support for mental and physical health, being able to cope with the stress that comes when one is not in their home country. There are many examples that we might give, but generally, conventional success measures or well-being measures conventional success measures such as enrollment numbers, graduation rates, or well-being do not capture these well-being dimensions or examples that we just gave. So from a responsible perspective, if quality is to be meaningful, the capability approach helps us to ask questions such as, do international students have real choices and opportunities to be the best versions of themselves? Are they able to live and learn with dignity and respect without prejudice? And does internationalization genuinely expand their opportunities and improve their well-being? Patience will show us in the slides that she will present, but just to introduce the study that is informing this presentation. Our thinking about responsible internationalization started 2 years ago, and it was informed by the study that we did between 2021 and 2023, but we were focusing on learning experiences between 2020 and 2022. So we worked at 3 South African institutions, 2 urban universities, and 1 rural university. What we're interested in was student and staff experiences of teaching and learning during the pandemic. The stories shared by both students and staff made us to think more about quality, what it means to be part of an international institution and what quality looks like within that specific institution. And this is what has led to this presentation and possibly the paper that we will publish in the near future. I think Patience, now it's your turn to give us some examples and also take us through responsible internationalization, because we deliberately didn't introduce that in the beginning because we wanted to lay the foundation of how we got there. Over to you, Patience.
All right, thanks, Faith. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, great. Right, thank you, everyone. So I'm going to pick up where Faith left off. So there are different types of conceptual underpinnings of internationalization, and South Africa mostly follows a comprehensive approach, which is a broad institutional commitment to integrating international and intercultural perspectives in all aspects of the university, which is a good conceptual framing. But we are going a bit further to propose that the notion of responsible internationalization might add something to that. So this emphasizes the ethical and sustainable aspects of international activities, especially individuals and institutions' responsibilities to ensure positive societal impact and minimize potential harm. So it mostly focuses on the impact that international activities have on the various stakeholders involved and creating equitable partnerships. So she and Gavi note that responsible internationalization helps to raise awareness of the need for responsible practices and behavior in international partnerships at home, as well as strengthen the capacity to create such practices. And they note that it mostly has three major characteristics. So the first is that it should be actor-oriented. So this is where the actor, in this case, the university that is seeking to create these partnerships, it searches for information and assesses possible collaborations and actions. And where risks are observed, they implement mitigating strategies. Then the second aspect would be that the relationships need to be mutually beneficial. So these should be secure and judicious, so there should be no antagonism or the contravention of legislation on both sides, human rights and ethics. And these relationships should also be based on respect and trust. And the third aspect is the contextual circumstances need to be considered. So these contextual circumstances would be differences in national goals, geopolitics, different political systems, the legislation, the culture, issues of sustainability, and climate. So taking note of these three aspects, responsible internationalization highlights the relationship building in a world impacted by various global challenges and geopolitical competition. I'm sure we all know, like recently, that geopolitical issues are really destabilizing a lot of partnerships and connections. So we feel that responsible internationalization would be a good starting point to understanding such partnerships. Can we go to the next slide, Faith? Okay, so based on this understanding of internationalization, we are going to present a few excerpts that the lecturers gave us. And we, as Faith said, we spoke to both lecturers and students. We have presented students' views elsewhere. And here we're trying to focus on the lecturer's perspective to see how they can then help us to understand international student experiences, because the lecturers are a key stakeholder in internationalization. I'm sure we all know that they're the ones that deal with students and teach them, supervise them. So they've got these close relationships with students, and it's quite important then to understand how lecturers themselves view or understand student experiences. So that's how we are using their narratives. So the first point that was raised was around the tension between national directives to ensure security and issues of institutional freedom and autonomy, right? So we all know that during COVID, the national level policies were coming from the national level, right? And then we would be told that we are at lockdown level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this is what comes with these different lockdown levels. So what we're presenting here might have been specific to COVID, but we think that it goes beyond COVID. Some of the problems that were raised by lecturers and students started before COVID and even post-date COVID. So it then becomes important to look at COVID as an example of how internationalization can happen or can be improved, or challenges that lie in how it happens. So one of the lecturers said that he was explaining the different responses that the universities were putting in place to COVID. And then he said that I must also put a caveat that in as much as the university would want to do all these things for students, to help students, it also operates within a national framework and national boundaries. So sometimes what they might want might conflict with national laws and policies. So sometimes their hands might be tied. which is very true because the universities had to operate within the boundaries set by the national policies. But then from a responsible internationalization perspective, the national policy level is supposed to give guidelines, right? So they give guidelines and then the institutions then implement and put in place strategies that are aligned to those guidelines. So in such instances, that could have been a place for discussion to say, okay, at national policy level, we have to shut down the university, we have to restrict gathering, we have to move teaching and learning online, but we also need to think about students' well-being. And this was not just for international students, it was also for local South African students. I'm sure we're all familiar with the literature, the COVID literature on how teaching and learning happened and how students were struggling to connect, they had no devices, they were in unconducive environments and things like that. So such instances would have provided a chance for discussions and to see how the national level could have worked with universities to provide support for these students. I will come back to that issue in the next slide. So according to some scholars, the institutions showed evidence of non-education specialists driving the agenda because they were saying that teaching and learning being moved online was mostly a directive and academics and students' views were ignored, although they did say that institutions are not ready to move online, students do not have the capacity, but this was overridden and everything was moved online. So they were saying that it showed the dominance of non-education specialists, which needed to have been considered. Okay, can we go to the next stage? Thank you. Okay, so if we take the example for accommodation, for example, one lecturer noted how the decision to shut the residences really impacted students. So he said even deciding to shut the residences, then everyone's trying to frantically pack up and move and stuff. It was only belatedly that they then realized that there are people who don't have anywhere to go. And then they were flexible. Why didn't they realize that from the beginning? Why did they ever think they were just going to shut down the residences with 3 days notice? It was because of this crisis mentality or something, but obviously it wasn't thinking things through. And that stressed students. By the time they'd reversed the decision, many students who might have otherwise stayed had gone despite the challenges. So they were saying that it was a challenge for lecturers, but then for students, it really stressed them because now they had to pick up and they were given 3 days notice. They had to make a plan. So some students, lecturers also spoke about some students who went and did not return to university, or they struggled to learn and their grades were not really the best that they could have been if they had had conducive environments, right? So here, the universities could have implemented a more differential approach based on students' needs, where students who really didn't have anywhere to go, who did not have conducive environments, could have stayed in residence, because when they eventually reversed the decision, some students did stay, but others had already gone, although they really didn't need to go, or they had nowhere really to go, but they went because of the circumstances, right? They had no option. So they struggled because of that. So we're saying from the perspective of responsible internationalization, the government does provide a national policy guideline, but universities need to uphold those respectful, trusting, and mutually beneficial relationships that exist. So issues of empathy also need to come into those discussions, where they could have found a way forward that would have been more conducive for students as well. Next slide, please. Okay, and then another lecturer also spoke about how most of the lecturers actually said they didn't know if they had international students in their classes or how many they had, right? Or what countries they were from. So one of the lecturers said, I was only made aware of the presence of the great number of international students when I attended a presentation at the Faculty of Education on the unique needs of international students. To be honest, up to that point in my teaching, I wasn't teaching in a way where I was particularly cognizant of them as a kind of a constituency in my class. And that presentation made me aware of the need to be selective in the examples that I use and not to assume that things a South African student knows are known by everybody. Perhaps using an Afrikaans term, for example, which I would assume that everybody understood. I now think through and contextualize the examples I use. So because lecturers were not aware of the presence of international students, they would teach in a way that would assume maybe prior knowledge or an assumption of Afrikaans as a language, those kinds of examples. And that would exclude certain students. The lecturer went on to say, but international students come up to me and say, I don't understand, I'm an international student. But it's not always all students who come forward to say that. So lecturers also need to be considerate of this fact. And here we draw on Mark et al., who talk about culturally responsive pedagogies that consider students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds and culturally informed learning behaviors. That is important for lecturers to be aware of it and to be trained in terms of culturally responsive pedagogies so that they can then foster that kind of learning where cultural sensitivity happens and learning and interactions are fostered. All right, next slide, Faith. And then, so this was one of the lecturers who was talking about how he relates to students. So most lecturers were saying we don't really know much about students, but this lecturer said he stood out in that he tried to understand students. So he said there's quite a few that we ended up tracking down because if somebody just disappeared, I want to know what's happened and not just leave them, forget them. You tend not to know the issues they face, and it's good if they know that we're willing to try and find a way of making this work for them. And so if you make that bit of extra effort to be able to try and keep them on board. So he was saying it was really important for students to feel valued and not feel that they're invisible. So even if lecturers are there to teach, as most lecturers said, we're just here to teach, and we're not supposed to have any sort of interactions with students, which is fine. But then there are certain interactions that are allowed, that create an enabling environment, a welcoming environment for the students. So here we note that if without internationalization as a mindset that's pervading an institution's learning and teaching culture, it risks remaining a niche project dependent on the efforts of a few individuals. So this will then lead us to some of the recommendations that we give later on. Next slide. Okay, so based on this, we started thinking about the way of broadening our understanding of internationalization, where, yes, strategies enable access to international education, but challenges in practice inhibit the quality of these strategies and practices. So mostly, it's enacted as a technical and procedural process that focuses on student numbers. As Faith said earlier, there's an assumption that if there are international students, if they're international academics, then intercultural learning is happening. Then we are seeing the benefits of internationalization, but it's not always the case. Right? And then, as I noted earlier, international students' challenges pre and post date the pandemic. And then also we realized that South Africa and the institutions that exist, the 26 universities that they have differences in terms of the resources and institutional commitments to internationalization, right? And this also then influences the strategies and the support that is in place for international students. And the processes.
Wrap up for
Yes?
us. The time is
Sorry?
almost up. Your time is
Okay.
up, so wrap up.
Okay, I'm wrapping up. Thank you. Next slide, Faith. Okay, so from there, we started thinking about how to reframe the quality of internationalization. So the first step would be to mainstream responsible internationalization key aspects. Those three that I spoke about, the mutually beneficial relationships, actor orientation, and contextual awareness. So building them in so that internationalization is not just enacted by the international office as a separate office or different academics implementing different practices. So kind of mainstreaming it in would make it important. And then to contextualize and an institution-wide process where there's a shared understanding of internationalization at the institutional level. Then to implement quality assurance guidelines that are aligned with the institution's goals. And then these can then, when they're clearly outlined, these can then be funded and evaluated as quality measures for internationalization. Next slide. So we also just looked at one example where we can say an example of a quality indicator can be something around student well-being. Now, beyond just the numbers, where to say we've got X number of international students, qualitative data on student experiences and well-being would really be helpful to build up that argument on how internationalization would enhance teaching and learning, would enhance research, right? So it would also help us understand student experiences versus the stated internationalization aims, because as Faith noted, at the policy level, they advertise an international learning, they advertise cross-cultural competencies, things like that. But how then are they going to see that it's actually happening to enhance teaching and learning and the other relationships at the university? So yes, that was our idea, that student well-being would be a good indicator. Next slide, Faith. So based on that, we kind of came up with this framework where we have the national policy guidelines at the top, because in the quality assurance the national framework on internationalization says it's up to the institutions to implement measures that ensure quality. So it leaves it up to the universities to come up with these guidelines. So if it's guided by responsible internationalization, where you have those three factors, that will kind of guide the quality indicators that are put in place. And for us, our example would be around capability expansion and around well-being. So yes, that's it. I think the next slide is the thank you slide.
All right, thank you very much, Doc, for the presentation. Can we move on to the discussant? Dr. Nico, could you unmute your mic?
Oh, there is my mic. And I think there's my camera just for a while. I'll switch it off again. Thank you. I think we've got only, I'll try and make my comments shorter then, because you only have 15 minutes left. Firstly, I'm very happy that you as a group have started again a debate on internationalization. I think we don't have enough debates in South Africa on internationalization. And for that reason, the policy framework, which you refer to rightfully throughout your paper, the policy framework, people refer to it when they want to make a point, but I don't know how many universities have actually already, and which that's the bottom line of the policy framework, have developed proper internationalization strategies for the institution. Because if there is a proper internationalization strategy, all the issues that you've raised in your presentation should actually find themselves in your own institutional strategy. And that brings me to the term that you use, responsible internationalization. And I don't know, I don't see any reference to it, but whether you started to talk about responsible internationalization after you've read Stein's work. That's where the whole notion of responsible internationalization started. And of course, it started a big debate in the higher education internationalization environment. And I was one of those that is still part of the debate. So if we're now talking about responsible internationalization, what was the irresponsible internationalization? Or are we not, if we, by using responsible, are we not just referring to the negative? And the reason why I'm just raising this is that's why when we over years started to say to each other, how do you get a term that would be not neutral but wouldn't raise eyebrows? We came up with the term comprehensive internationalization. And you can actually within comprehensive internationalization find different nuances in it. So just as far as the paper is concerned, reading through the paper, the first part of it, and I'll send you my comments if you want it. But just reading through it, I think you need to really define more specifically why you're using the term responsible internationalization, and it doesn't have to stand. And I'm not saying you shouldn't use the term. I'm not saying that, but just make sure that it doesn't create a negative connotation, because there are too many spaces at the moment where I'm just worried that the language people are using in the space, and you are not using that language, so I'm not referring to you, but the language that people are using are more anti-internationalization than pro. And I think we as international educators must be very careful in making value judgments around internationalization instead of us actually engaging with the terms and the activities in such a way that we promote internationalization. We are, and you rightfully, you said that in your presentation and in your paper, we are in a very, very peculiar space. I've been doing internationalization for 25 years, and I've never been in this space where I don't know whether the next international conference in Europe is really going to take place because of the negativities that are around. And because the whole focus on nationalism is taking away the whole notion of internationalization. Now, my own view is, and I would really like to engage with you as scholars on this, I think there's an opportunity for us that we can move back to thinking internationally than just purely globally. Remember, over a few years ago, the whole notion of globalization, which we all also had an issue with, was largely responsible for some of the negativities around internationalization. I think the overemphasis now on international and rather national is also putting internationalization at risk. So I think we're at a very peculiar time in internationalization, and because of that, I'm just saying we must be very careful on our language, how we use it and what we write, because the critical thinkers are not critical thinkers as we experienced them 10 years ago. They are differently critical at the moment. Just to refer you to the term that I use more is systemic internationalization. You know, when you in your presentation spoke about internationalization not happening in all spaces in a university, it's because there isn't real systemic internationalization. And I would like to refer you to the work of my mentor, Joe Mestenhauser, on systemic internationalization. at the Free State, I did ask your international office. There's a book out on Mestenhauser and systems thinking on internationalization, where a lot of people have written in the book. And what I would just say to you in enhancing your thinking in the paper, just read a little bit about Mestenhauser and his philosophy around systems and systemic internationalization. Systemic and comprehensive, one need to ask ourselves, or even if you want to say responsible, I think the three words can live together: responsible, systemic, and comprehensive. And it would be probably for you making your article much more valuable if you can incorporate the terminologies right up front and then carry through with your article. I just want to caution. Look, we all know what COVID did to internationalization. And I think it was a unique experience. And I hope it's the first time and the last time that universities will have to go through an experience like that. What I would do rather is using the COVID experience as examples on how universities should prepare themselves for crises. Because the next crisis would hit universities, and are they now ready to handle their international students, and not only international students, but the whole notion of internationalization differently? We were all caught off guard. And I'm not only talking about South Africa, the whole world was caught off guard. I've asked this question now at an international conference, and no one gave me an answer. I asked the question, are we ready for a next global negative experience? The Trump nuances in America, and that's my conclusion. The Trump nuances in America is not much different from COVID, where he's so anti-international with a specific focus. And if you just look how badly the American universities are reacting to that, it says to me, we're not ready. We haven't learned lessons. So in conclusion, responsible internationalization have different nuances, and the examples you used are excellent, but I think the question we must ask ourselves, for responsible internationalization to live in all universities, have we learned lessons, and are we ready for the next dramatic experience? But thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Doc, for your reflections. I don't know if the presenter would like to speak.
Yes, I'll start, and maybe Patience can add. Thank you very much for the comments, the suggestions, and the questions. Are we ready for the next pandemic, as it were, or the next disruption? I think, as you rightly pointed out in final bits of your talk, clearly we are not ready for the next disruption. But the question is, are we doing something to prepare? And if we are, what are the things that we are doing as institutions? Because as you rightly point out, the universities in America are actually responding in a way that shows that they are not ready for the next disruption. So I guess it's a question around what should we be doing to prepare based on what we as internationalization scholars are actually seeing, and as institutions are seeing happening elsewhere. In relation to that, we are in a very tricky situation when it comes to internationalization at the moment. I highly agree with you. I was also at a conference last year. There is more talk about regionalization now than internationalization. But I think the view generally is that there is feeding for example, nationalizing can feed to regionalization, and regionalization can feed to internationalization. I think the point is trying to find ways in which we can learn from each other, rather than, for example, let's say South African institutions isolate themselves from the rest of the region or from the rest of the world. In terms of using the concepts, I agree as well. We're continually thinking about the use of our concepts, of the concept of responsible internationalization, but we're looking at it based on students and staff experiences from a capabilities lens that really focuses much more on student and staff experiences more than the broad abstract terminologies that are being used within the space of internationalization. I'm not sure if Patience wants to add anything, because Gloria is saying that 2 minutes left. I don't know if Patience, it would be great if Patience could say something related to quality.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just quickly say something. It was I agree with what you said, Faith, and thank you very much for the comments, Prof. It was really quite helpful. We look forward to getting more comprehensive feedback on the paper. So the idea of using responsible internationalization was appealing to us mostly because of the emphasis on the ethical and sustainable aspects of these relationships that are built through internationalization. So that was the major appeal for using that, but we'll continue to read around and see how we can strengthen it, and also to feed into the idea of capability expansion and well-being, which we think are quite critical to higher education.
All right, thank you so much. I don't know if you have any questions. So can we just
He's got his hand up.
all right, some more, go ahead. Your mic.
Thank you for the. Can you hear me? Good morning, colleagues, or good afternoon.
Hi, Sam.
Thanks for the presentation. I have one or two comments which I wanted to make. The first one is a big question, and you don't really have to answer, is why using the concept of quality at all in your presentation? Because I think there is a much stronger and even slightly different, but similar to what you're saying, argument around the notion of internationalization, which Nico also highlighted. So for me, the first thing is that there is no national policy around internationalization. The South African higher education policy is very, very nationalistic. It's very, very focused on the national dimension. And this has, to some extent, ignored the benefits of internationalization, which some of which you mentioned, the issue of well-being. Some of the international students actually get to realize much of their functionings through opportunities to study, the freedom to speak, the freedom to travel, the freedom to communicate to the broader context of knowledge, which they will not have in their local countries. So South Africa is actually offering that opportunity. And the list is long if you want to look at the functioning that are developed by South African universities to international students. However, without this national policy at the institutional level, which Patience has nicely presented, is the fact that the lack of the national policy translates at the institutional level. So when we are having policies around accommodation, they ignore the international students. If you're having the practice of teaching and learning, they ignore the international students. So the lack of a national framework for me, the lack of institutional frameworks around internationalization is actually constraining the functionings which could and which are being developed within the institutions through internationalization. So for me, that really, it seems to address one of the concerns of Nico, which is how do you define responsible internationalization? But if you leave it as a broad concept, then you can actually make the comment that South African universities are actually supporting various functionings through the international system. However, the policy at the national level, the policy at the institutional level, the practice at the institutional level is constraining internationalization. I will end by saying that that goes even to the fact that in many countries where internationalization is a big thing at the national level, the UK, Canada, the US, they actually go further to do studies on the socio-economic benefits of internationalization to show how much it's happening. And in South Africa, that's not the conversation. And so I think that there is actually, and if you look at the three factors which you mentioned, maybe you should add one, or you should structure the one around the policy environment, which is not very supportive. So for me, I find it very interesting, but I could actually make a different kind of argument which you are making. But again, it's looking at how internationalization supports the development and functionings and capabilities of students. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I was long.
Thank you, Sam, for the suggestions given. I think we are far behind time, so I don't know if there's any burning question. Just a quick one, so that we come to the end of the session.
Just to also thank Sam for the comment. I think you have mentioned about how you would actually argue in a different way. That's an idea that you're giving us for the next paper, or something that we could actually work into this paper, because yes, there are functionings that are actually developed by the system in South Africa, which we could literally look at. Maybe it could be the first part of the paper, but that's very helpful also. Thank you, Sam.
All right, thanks so much to everyone for attending the webinar.
Daisy, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say, anybody with comments, feedback, you can email them to us. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
All right, I was just about saying that story, but it's fine. Yeah. I want to thank Dr. Nico for your time on the reflection on the paper. We are so much grateful for the limited time you had. You were able to step in for us, so we are so much grateful. And those who attended online, we are so grateful, and we look forward to seeing you the next BBT, which is going to happen on the next 2 weeks. No, not BBT anymore. It's a webinar series. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. All right. Bye-bye. Bye. All right. We can leave.